In the forgotten corridors of 20th century history, there exist shadows that official records were never meant to illuminate. Behind sealed vault doors, misfiled archives, and redacted intelligence reports lies a version of the Second World War that never entered textbooks. It is a version steeped in silence, buried in the bureaucratic language of classified and restricted, where atrocities were disguised as accidents and grand strategies carried the weight of crimes too large to acknowledge. The war, officially framed as a clash of good versus evil, was also a battlefield of secrets, where entire populations vanished without testimony, and alliances concealed brutal betrayals. These are not battlefield heroics or cinematic victories. These are stories deliberately locked away, their paper trails shredded, their survivors silenced. They surface only when fragments appear. An intercepted cable here, a forgotten memo there, the whispered confession of an aging witness. Each fragment is a scar across the memory of the century. They remind us that war is not only fought with tanks and rifles, but also with secrecy, deception, and silence. The deeper we look into these hidden files, the more unsettling truths emerge. Truths that governments considered too destabilizing for public knowledge. Tonight, we open 4 long-buried dossiers, each one a revelation of brutality, ambition, and manipulation hidden from history's stage. What you are about to hear is not myth. These are documented realities erased from public memory, resurfacing like voices from a locked crypt. This is the war we were never meant to remember. Chapter 1. The Secret Soviet POW Massacres. In the closing months of 1943, when the Red Army had finally halted the German advance and the tide of war began to turn eastward, a series of directives quietly passed through the channels of Soviet high command. These were not battlefield orders, nor troop deployments, nor production schedules for tanks and artillery. They were instructions marked with the insignia of the NKVD, stamped with the chilling phrase, Osobo Sekretno, top secret. Among these files, later unearthed in fragments from declassified archives, was a chilling codename, Operation Trudovaya Krov. Translated loosely, it meant labor by blood. The operation was not designed to win territory. It was designed to erase human beings. Axis prisoners of war, especially those deemed irreformable enemies, were condemned not to forced labor or indefinite confinement, but to systematic extermination masked by the language of attrition. The official Soviet narrative portrayed POW camps as brutal but functional institutions, designed to extract labor from captives for the reconstruction of a devastated nation. Reality diverged sharply. From Smolensk to the northern reaches of Vorkuta, entire compounds became silent execution grounds. The method was subtle by design. Men were starved under carefully rationed diets that ensured gradual collapse of the body. Winter clothing was deliberately withheld. Medical aid was rationed only for those considered useful. The result was mass death, attributed conveniently to natural conditions of war. But for those who crossed certain invisible thresholds, officers of the Waffen-SS, Gestapo operatives, Luftwaffe pilots with high kill counts, the process was expedited. These men were summoned at night, marched into the frost, and dispatched with a single round to the base of the skull, a method already perfected by NKVD executioners at Katyn in 1940. Signals intelligence intercepted by the OSS as early as 1944 hinted at these events. Cables marked Moscow-Smolensk supply transfers included anomalies. Trains scheduled with provisions but returning suspiciously light, as if cargo had never been delivered. Alongside, whispers from escaped Wehrmacht officers reached British intelligence through Sweden. They spoke of pits dug into frozen ravines, where hundreds of bodies were heaped together, lime thrown over them to disguise decomposition. One survivor, Lieutenant Hans Richter, later testified to being marched away from Camp 126 near Tambov. He described hearing shots, screams muffled by the snow, and returning alone days later, emaciated but alive, to find his entire unit vanished without trace. The Soviet leadership denied such accusations categorically. To acknowledge them would have undermined the fragile alliance with Britain and the United States. Western governments, aware of this reality, chose silence. Memos from the Foreign Office, declassified decades later, reveal clear knowledge of the atrocities. A particularly stark line, written by a mid-level diplomat in 1945, stated, "Though reports of German losses in Soviet custody may constitute crimes, disclosure would imperil unity at this critical juncture." And so silence prevailed. Public attention was carefully diverted to Nazi atrocities, while Soviet crimes disappeared beneath the fog of victory propaganda. The geography of the killings was as vast as the Soviet Union itself. In the forests outside Smolensk, in the Gulag mines of Kolyma, in the permafrost of Vorkuta, men perished in numbers that official Soviet statistics reduced to non-returnees. The reality was more sinister. A 1946 NKVD report, partially recovered by Russian historians before being reclassified in the 1990s, revealed that out of 2.8 million German POWs held in Soviet custody, nearly 1 million never emerged. Disease and malnutrition were cited as the primary causes, but footnotes marked with the initials of Lavrentiy Beria, Stalin's feared security chief, contain annotations in red pencil. Ustranit skorostno, eliminate swiftly. Such notes are not epidemiology, they are orders. The methods of concealment were meticulous. Death certificates listed starvation, typhus, or frostbite. Camps were dismantled and repurposed within weeks, leaving no fixed structures for investigators. In some cases, survivors were forced to dig mass graves, fill them with comrades, then marched away to uncertain fates themselves. Evidence was scattered, fragmentary, and deliberately obscured. By the time Allied inspectors requested access in 1947, the sites had been sanitized, the graves overgrown, the barracks re-erected as reform colonies. Yet fragments of truth could not be entirely suppressed. In 1950, Soviet defectors began leaking details to Western intelligence during the first years of the Cold War. One former NKVD clerk, who escaped through Iran, described the chilling efficiency of the record-keeping. He recalled execution quotas delivered monthly to camp commandants, disguised in statistical ledgers under the column "Transfer to Moscow." In reality, each number corresponded to prisoners scheduled for termination. These clerks were instructed to burn auxiliary notes immediately after transmission, ensuring no paper trail remained. But a handful of these documents survived, buried in forgotten annexes of Soviet archives, only to resurface decades later when the regime itself began to crumble. The human stories hidden behind these numbers remain staggering. Consider the case of Oberstleutnant Friedrich Keller, a decorated tank commander captured outside Kursk. Records show his transfer to a labor camp in Kolyma in January 1944. He disappears from official Soviet documentation within weeks. Yet in 1963, a miner in Magadan unearthed a rusted Wehrmacht dog tag during excavation. Etched into it was Keller's identification number. Oral testimonies from camp survivors claimed Keller was executed in the winter of 1944 after refusing to work under collapsing shafts. His body, they said, was dumped into a snow-covered trench with dozens of others, their corpses preserved in the permafrost like relics awaiting discovery. His family in Munich never learned his fate. Official records listed him as missing in action. The deliberate suppression extended beyond the Soviet Union. Western archives reveal a calculated decision to bury knowledge of these massacres. In 1947, General Eisenhower received a classified report from the Office of Policy Coordination, later folded into the CIA. The report, titled Axis Personnel Non-Returnees in Soviet Custody, explicitly outlined evidence of executions. Eisenhower's marginalia reads, "Cannot pursue. Public revelation would fracture fragile post-war order." The report was shelved, marked for restricted circulation only, and remained hidden until a partial declassification in the 1990s. What remains most disturbing is the silence that followed. Unlike Katyn, which eventually forced its way into global consciousness, these massacres never became part of public discourse. Survivors aged, died, and their testimonies faded. Families were left with missing designations that provided no closure. Graves remain unmarked in Russian forests, the ground above them bearing only the weight of silence. And so, history records a sanitized version of events, that Soviet camps were harsh, but survivable, that death came from nature, not design, that alliances were untainted by atrocities. The truth was deliberately obscured by the needs of geopolitics. To this day, Russian officialdom denies systematic executions of German prisoners. Archives that once hinted at the truth have been sealed once again under the label state security. Independent researchers who venture too far into this territory face harassment, confiscation of materials, or sudden revocation of access. What remains are fragments, testimonies whispered to descendants, declassified cables in Western vaults, and bones that occasionally surface from the soil when new roads are cut through the forests of Smolensk or when mines in Kolyma collapse. The silence is perhaps the greatest crime of all. These were men condemned not by battlefield justice, but by the stroke of a pen, erased in a manner meant to deny even memory. The Soviet state buried their deaths under euphemism and bureaucracy, while the Western powers allowed the silence to persist for fear of breaking the post-war order. Together, they created a void in history, one in which hundreds of thousands of lives disappeared without recognition. The ground itself still holds their testimony, waiting for a day when the silence will no longer suffice. And thus, the first file is opened. A story of men who marched into captivity only to vanish into the Soviet night. Their existence reduced to lines in a ledger, their deaths disguised as natural attrition. Their voices remain buried, yet in the fragments of declassified files and in the testimonies of the few who escaped, their truth continues to whisper from beneath the frostbound soil. Chapter 2. Churchill's Hidden Chemical Weapons Plan. The spring of 1944 marked a turning point in the war, but not only on the front lines of Normandy or in the ruins of bombed-out Berlin. Deep within the War Cabinet's files at Whitehall, documents stamped with red ink and the words, "Most Secret, File HS-13, contained a plan so disturbing that even decades later, its very existence seems surreal. Buried under codenames and bureaucratic jargon was a contingency strategy approved at the highest level, Operation Vegetarian. Unlike the grand offensives of the Allies, this was no conventional military plan. It was the systematic preparation of a biological weapon capable of rendering entire regions of Europe uninhabitable for generations. Its instrument was not artillery, nor bombs, nor tanks, but microscopic spores, Bacillus anthracis, anthrax. In the sterile language of the documents, it was described as an agricultural disruption strategy. In truth, it was a weapon of extermination disguised as science. By 1942, Britain had already begun secret trials of this weapon. Gruinar Island, an isolated patch of land off the Scottish coast, became the site of what declassified memos later referred to as Field Test Alpha. RAF aircraft dropped experimental bombs loaded with anthrax-laced linseed cakes, their intended design being deceptively simple. Livestock would consume the cakes, contract anthrax, and perish. Human populations reliant on contaminated meat and milk would soon follow. Contemporary photographs once classified show herds of sheep bloated grotesquely in the grass, their carcasses splitting under the pressure of internal decay. The soil itself remained poisoned. For decades, Gruinard Island was quarantined, fenced with barbed wire, and marked with skull and crossbones signs warning of lethal contamination. The island's curse was proof of the weapon's efficiency. At the heart of this plan was Winston Churchill. In the aftermath of the devastating V2 rocket campaign against London, Churchill's tone hardened. Declassified minutes from War Cabinet discussions reveal his words. If Germany resorts to indiscriminate terror, we must not shrink from measures which will devastate her soil and cripple her people. The logic was ruthless. Conventional bombing had failed to break German morale. The atomic bomb, still years from deployment in Europe, was uncertain. But anthrax, silent, invisible, and indiscriminate, promised results. The RAF designed modified Lancaster bombers capable of dispersing millions of the linseed cakes over Bavarian farmland, targeting regions crucial to German food production. The planners calculated that once infected, cattle populations would collapse within weeks. With poisoned meat entering supply chains, famine and epidemic would spread across the Reich, achieving through biology what bombing had failed to deliver. The files also reveal the disturbing scale of preparation. By the summer of 1944, Britain had stockpiled nearly 5 million anthrax-laced cakes. Produced in a secret facility near Porton Down, Wiltshire, the project operated under the cover name Special Research Department. Scientists worked in sealed laboratories, their protective suits crudely stitched and their filters prone to failure. Internal reports describe at least 4 laboratory deaths, quietly buried in obscure medical records. Each cake was small, brown, and innocuous, perfectly resembling ordinary livestock feed. The chilling efficiency of the design lay in its banality. To German farmers, they would have seemed like harmless supplements scattered from the sky. In reality, each cake was a potential epidemic in waiting. Yet even within Whitehall, Unease spread. Memos circulated from the Ministry of Agriculture warning of unpredictable consequences should wines shift or dispersal fail. Some feared that if Germany retaliated in kind, Britain's own vulnerable farmland could become a graveyard. Others raised moral objections, comparing the plan to the chemical atrocities of the First World War. But Churchill remained firm. In July 1944, he signed a personal directive stating, "The time may come when we must use this weapon without hesitation. We cannot allow Germany to dictate the terms of terror unchallenged." His words sealed the project's momentum. The project's secrecy was absolute. Even within the Allied coalition, the existence of Operation Vegetarian was concealed. The United States, though aware of biological warfare research at Porton Down, was never given full access to the files. The Soviet Union remained entirely ignorant, its intelligence services later struggling to piece together fragments of information from defectors and intercepted communications. In this way, Britain preserved an option of last resort, a weapon too devastating to be acknowledged, yet prepared in silence for deployment should the war turn against them. The irony of Operation Vegetarian lies in its non-execution. By late 1944, Germany's defeat seemed increasingly inevitable through conventional means. The invasion of Normandy, the Soviet advance on the Eastern Front, and the gradual collapse of German logistics reduced the urgency of deploying biological warfare. In February 1945, the War Cabinet reviewed the plan one final time. The stockpiles of cakes were ordered destroyed under controlled incineration, though documents suggest not all were accounted for. Some crates were listed as missing during transit, a phrase that has fueled speculation about post-war dispersal or secret retention for Cold War purposes. Grunwald Island remained lethal until 1986, when it was finally decontaminated under a $500,000 project involving formaldehyde and seawater. Until then, it stood as a toxic monument to a weapon almost unleashed. The legacy of the plan was carefully hidden from public consciousness. Official histories of the war made no mention of it. Churchill's memoirs omitted even a passing reference. For decades, Grunwald Island's quarantine was explained away as a scientific experiment gone wrong. Only in the 1990s, when declassification laws pried open War Cabinet files, did the scope of the plan become clear. Researchers were stunned to discover just how close Britain came to contaminating vast swathes of Europe with anthrax. The sanitized language of the documents belied their horror. Phrases like agricultural disruption and livestock incapacitation masked the reality of famine, epidemic, and death on a scale rivaling nuclear devastation. The moral implications remain staggering. Churchill, celebrated for his leadership in the war, authorized preparations for a weapon that could have annihilated millions of civilians. The justification that it was a necessary countermeasure to German terror does little to diminish the darkness of the intent. Operation Vegetarian exposes a side of Allied strategy seldom acknowledged. The willingness to employ total war methods that blurred the line between military and civilian, combatant and non-combatant. It demonstrates how desperation, fear, and retaliation could lead even democratic governments into the shadows of extermination planning. To this day, questions linger. Were all the anthrax stockpiles truly destroyed? Were some retained, quietly adapted into Cold War bioweapons research? Why did Churchill's successors maintain silence long after the war's end? Long after the threat of German retaliation had vanished? The declassified files answer some questions but raise many more. They remind us that victory narratives often hide darker truths, that even the champions of democracy were willing to flirt with apocalyptic solutions. The Grunwald tests, the stockpiled cakes, the coded memos, all remain as silent testimony to a plan that history almost erased. Operation Vegetarian was never executed, yet its shadow remains. It is a reminder of the fragility of moral boundaries in times of desperation. It is proof that even the leaders celebrated as defenders of freedom were willing to gamble with humanity's survival in the pursuit of victory. And above all, it is a chilling illustration of how close the world came to an invisible war. One waged not with bullets and bombs, but with spores carried by the wind, capable of killing generations unborn. Chapter 3: Japan's Atrocities in Unit 731. Hidden in the cold expanse of occupied Manchuria, beyond the walls of Harbin's eastern suburbs, the Japanese Imperial Army constructed a facility known to the outside world only as a water purification plant. In reality, it was the headquarters of Unit 731, a sprawling complex of barracks, laboratories, crematoriums, and execution grounds where some of the darkest crimes of the Second World War were committed under the guise of science. Led by General Shiro Ishii, a physician turned military researcher, Unit 731 conducted experiments that blurred the line between medical study and mechanized cruelty. Officially classified as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, its mission was cloaked in the sterile language of hygiene and disease control. In truth, it was a human laboratory where thousands of prisoners were dissected, infected, mutilated, and killed in the name of biological warfare. The scale of the operation was staggering. The compound stretched over 6 square kilometers, enclosed by high walls and barbed wire, guarded day and night by soldiers of the Kempeitai, Japan's feared military police. Inside, brick laboratories housed cages of plague-infested rats and glass tanks of bacteria cultures. Underground chambers functioned as holding cells, where prisoners, referred to coldly as maruta, logs, were prepared for experimentation. These prisoners included Chinese civilians, captured Soviet soldiers, Korean resistance fighters, and even some Allied POWs who had fallen into Japanese hands. They were stripped of names, reduced to numbers, their identities erased as thoroughly as their humanity. The goal was not healing, but weaponization. To perfect tools of war that could cripple enemy populations with disease and suffering. The methods employed by Unit 731 defy comprehension. Prisoners were deliberately infected with plague, cholera, typhoid, and anthrax, then observed as their bodies deteriorated under meticulously documented conditions. Frostbite experiments subjected captives to sub-zero temperatures until their flesh froze solid. Researchers would then thaw limbs under warm water or flames to study the effects of tissue damage. Victims were dissected alive without anesthesia, their organs removed and examined in real time while their hearts still beat. Pregnant women were infected with syphilis to track transmission to unborn children. Children were tied to stakes in open fields as plague-infected fleas were released upon them, testing vectors for large-scale biological deployment. Each act was conducted with cold detachment, documented in notebooks that later became bargaining chips for immunity. By 1942, Ishii's unit had expanded its research into field trials. Entire Chinese villages were targeted with aerial bombs filled with ceramic canisters of plague-infected fleas. Grain laced with cholera was introduced into rivers and wells. These experiments were not confined to the laboratory. They were weapons tests executed on unsuspecting populations. Reports estimate that over 200,000 civilians perished as a direct result of Unit 731's operations. Yet the full extent of the death toll remains uncertain, hidden in incomplete records and unmarked graves scattered across Manchuria. As the war approached its end in 1945, the Japanese High Command ordered the destruction of Unit 731's facilities to conceal evidence. Buildings were dynamited, documents burned, and remaining prisoners executed. Witnesses describe smoke rising for days as the crematoriums worked at full capacity. But fragments survived. Photographs hidden in personal belongings, testimonies of escaped workers, and scattered reports seized by advancing Soviet forces. These fragments told a story too disturbing for tribunals and too valuable for intelligence services to discard. Here lies the darkest chapter of Unit 731's legacy, the post-war bargain. When the United States occupied Japan, they learned of Ishii's work through captured officers and documents. Instead of prosecuting Ishii and his scientists at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, US intelligence struck a deal. Under a secret extension of Operation Paperclip, the American military granted immunity to Ishii and his associates in exchange for exclusive access to their research on biological warfare. Files once stamped top secret, national security justification reveal that the Pentagon considered this data too valuable to destroy. The atrocities were rebranded as scientific assets, their perpetrators shielded from justice while their victims vanished into silence. Ishii himself lived comfortably in Tokyo until his death in 1959, never facing trial, never offering testimony. The Soviet Union, by contrast, held its own tribunal in Khabarovsk in 1949, where 12 captured Japanese officers were tried for biological warfare crimes. Transcripts of the proceedings reveal shocking detail. Confessions of frostbite experiments, plague bombings, and vivisections. Yet the trials were dismissed in the West as propaganda, their evidence buried under Cold War distrust. For decades, Western historians ignored Soviet records, convinced that such horrors were fabrications of communist courts. Only when survivors and declassified files emerged in the late 20th century did the truth gain recognition. The human toll remains immeasurable. Survivors describe the haunting silence of the barracks at night, broken only by the cries of the infected. Guards forced prisoners to watch each other die, instilling terror as a form of psychological conditioning. Children grew skeletal within weeks, their bodies ravaged by pathogens introduced into their food. Women subjected to sexual violence in the name of venereal disease research left behind no testimony, only rumors and fragments pieced together decades later. Even the Japanese staff who worked at Unit 731 carried scars. Some broke down during testimony, admitting that their souls were permanently stained by the work. Others remained cold, insisting that duty and orders justified their actions. The physical evidence of Unit 731 was largely erased, yet traces remain. The ruins of the Harbin compound still stand, some restored as a museum, others left to decay under snow and weeds. Visitors walk through the corridors where experiments once unfolded, past glass cases displaying surgical instruments, rusted restraints, and photographs retrieved from hidden archives. The air carries the weight of memory, a silent testament to crimes designed to vanish but too vast to remain forgotten. What makes Unit 731's story most disturbing is not only the scale of its atrocities, but the deliberate suppression that followed. Governments chose to conceal the truth for strategic advantage, turning the suffering of thousands into bargaining chips. For decades, textbooks in Japan omitted mention of the unit. Survivors were silenced by stigma and fear. The West, eager to exploit the research, ensured that justice was never served. It was only through the persistence of historians, journalists, and descendants of victims that the narrative began to resurface in the 1980s and 1990s. Today, the name Unit 731 stands as shorthand for the darkest corners of human experimentation. Yet it remains lesser known than Nazi camps or Hiroshima's devastation, despite its horrors being no less grotesque. Its concealment reflects the uncomfortable truth that victors, too, have reasons to suppress history when it serves their interests. The atrocities of Harbin were not forgotten by accident. They were erased deliberately, covered in the language of secrecy and national security. The story of Unit 731 is not just a tale of wartime cruelty. It is a mirror held up to humanity's willingness to trade morality for power, to prioritize data over justice, to bury the cries of the dead beneath the ink of classified files. It is a story that continues to haunt the soil of Manchuria, the archives of Washington, and the conscience of a world that allowed science to become a weapon against its own species. Chapter 4: The Lost Gold of Operation. Konrad. In the dying months of the Third Reich, as Allied forces closed in from the west and Soviet armies pressed from the east, the Nazi leadership orchestrated a desperate series of convoys under the codename Operation Konrad. Unlike the military offensives that had borne the same name in Hungary earlier in the war, this final Konrad was not a battlefield maneuver but a financial exodus. The systematic looting and concealment of wealth seized during years of occupation, gold bars, diamonds, artwork stripped from Jewish families, and cultural treasures stolen from across Europe were loaded onto trains and convoys, departing Budapest under the supervision of the SS. Their destination was not Berlin, already in flames, but secret Alpine vaults and, in some cases, sympathetic Swiss intermediaries who promised discretion. Gestapo File No. 17, recovered from a Munich archive in 1946, refers cryptically to Konrad IV treasury. Consignments to be secured against Bolshevik seizure. Behind this dry language lay one of the largest movements of stolen wealth in modern history. The Hungarian reserves formed the heart of the operation. In March 1944, following Germany's occupation of Hungary, the SS moved swiftly to seize control of the Hungarian National Bank's gold reserves and foreign currency holdings. By late 1944, with the Red Army pushing into Central Europe, orders were issued to evacuate this wealth. Eyewitness accounts describe convoys of trucks and trains laden with crates, guarded by Waffen-SS detachments, rolling through the night toward the Austrian border. Among the cargo were not only gold ingots and banknotes, but also priceless artifacts. Torah scrolls from Budapest synagogues, jewels confiscated from deported families, and centuries-old paintings removed from private collections. Each crate bore the insignia of the Reich, each item a symbol of lives destroyed and cultures dismantled. In April 1945, one such train, later known as the Hungarian Gold train, was intercepted by elements of the US Third Army under General George S. Patton, codenamed Task Force Lucky. The American unit stumbled upon the treasure in Western Austria, where the train had been concealed in a remote siding. Inside its carriages lay staggering wealth, an estimated $200 million in gold, jewels, and cultural property. Official reports catalogued some of the items, but declassified documents decades later revealed troubling inconsistencies. Entire crates listed in initial inventories vanished from subsequent reports. Witness testimonies suggested that portions of the treasure were siphoned off by individuals within the occupying forces, quietly disappearing into private hands. Others hinted that intelligence agencies diverted sections of the hoard into secret accounts, later used to fund anti-Soviet operations during the early Cold War. The fog of post-war Europe provided fertile ground for such disappearances. The Allied Control Commission, tasked with documenting seized assets, received only partial records of the Hungarian treasure. Reports submitted in late 1946 listed approximately 200 crates of gold and valuables, yet survivor testimonies and Hungarian banking records indicated at least 350 had left Budapest. The discrepancy, 150 crates unaccounted for, remains unexplained. Some researchers argue they were laundered through Swiss banks under false names. Their proceeds funneled into covert operations such as Operation Gladio, NATO's secret stay-behind network in Europe. Others contend they were sold quietly through art markets. The origins of paintings and manuscripts deliberately obscured to erase their wartime trail. The human dimension of this loss is equally haunting. For Hungary's Jewish community, decimated by deportations to Auschwitz, the stolen heirlooms represented the last tangible connection to destroyed families. Survivors who returned after the war searched in vain for wedding rings, silver candlesticks, Torah crowns, and family jewels, only to be met with silence. When inquiries were made to Allied authorities, they were told the items had been secured or lost in transit. Lawsuits filed in US courts decades later revealed disturbing admissions. Occupation troops had in some cases used the valuables for personal enrichment, trading gold coins and jewels on the black market in war-torn Austria. The very forces tasked with liberating Europe had, in isolated cases, become custodians of theft. Switzerland's role remains one of the murkiest aspects of Operation Konrad. Neutral during the war, Swiss banks provided discreet channels for laundering stolen Nazi wealth. Declassified Allied intelligence reports from 1946 note large gold deposits appearing suddenly in Zurich and Geneva under coded accounts. Investigators believed these funds were tied directly to Operation Konrad shipments. Yet Swiss authorities maintained strict secrecy, shielding account holders under banking confidentiality laws. For decades, survivors and their descendants pressed for restitution, but efforts were met with bureaucratic obstruction. Only in the 1990s, under mounting international pressure, did Swiss banks acknowledge the presence of Nazi-looted assets, offering limited compensation. By then, most of the original owners were long dead, their heirlooms dispersed into anonymous vaults or lost entirely. The question of how much of the treasure was diverted for Cold War purposes remains unanswered. CIA memoranda from the early 1950s, partially declassified in the 1990s, contain references to non-attributable financial channels established in Austria using Axis-derived assets. While the documents do not explicitly mention the Hungarian gold train, the timing and language suggest a connection. Such funds would have been invaluable for covert operations in Eastern Europe, where the US sought to destabilize communist regimes. If true, it would mean that the wealth of murdered families helped finance the struggle against the very Soviet Union that had crushed Nazi Germany. A grim irony of geopolitics. Physical remnants of Operation Konrad continue to surface. In 1980, construction workers in Salzburg uncovered a buried cache of gold bars bearing Reich insignia, hidden beneath a collapsed bunker. In 1996, Hungarian researchers uncovered documents in Moscow archives referencing Hungarian consignments seized by the Red Army and transported eastward. These suggest that not all of the treasure was captured by the Americans. Some fell into Soviet hands, disappearing into the vast machinery of Soviet state finance. Like their Western counterparts, Soviet authorities never acknowledged the existence of these assets, leaving Hungary's cultural and financial losses unresolved. The legacy of Operation Konrad is not only financial, but historical. It represents the deliberate erasure of ownership, the transformation of lives and cultures into commodities shuffled across borders under the fog of war. Each bar of gold, each jewel, each stolen scroll carried with it the story of a family destroyed. Yet in the post-war world, these objects were stripped of context, reduced to assets traded in secret or absorbed into black budgets. Their origins were deliberately obscured, their rightful owners forgotten in the name of political expedience. Even today, the archives remain incomplete. Gestapo file no. 17 ends abruptly in April 1945 with the note "Consignment secured." Await further instruction. No subsequent files have been found. The Allied Control Commission records are redacted, missing entire pages from their inventories. Swiss banking archives remain sealed, citing confidentiality laws. The truth lies scattered across vaults, hidden in redacted cables, whispered in survivor testimonies, and buried in the soil of Austria and Hungary. Operation Konrad was more than theft. It was a vanishing act on a continental scale, one in which the victors, too, became complicit. The story of the lost gold remains unresolved. Were the missing crates siphoned into private accounts? Were they quietly laundered into Cold War intelligence operations? Do they still sit in Swiss vaults under silent account numbers? Or were they melted down, their traces erased forever? What is certain is that the treasure of Budapest, once intended to bankroll the survival of a collapsing Reich, became instead a hidden currency of the post-war world. Its shadow stretches across decades, a reminder that in war, not all thefts are recorded, not all crimes are judged, and not all treasures are returned. In the shadows of war, silence often speaks louder than memory. The files we have uncovered tell of massacres hidden under euphemism, weapons of extermination disguised as agricultural disruption, laboratories where science was twisted into cruelty, and treasure convoys that dissolved into the fog of post-war power politics. Each revelation is a fragment from a suppressed history, one deliberately buried by governments, erased from textbooks, and shielded from accountability. The Soviet archives that hint at mass executions remain sealed. The British experiments with anthrax were never intended to be remembered. Unit 731's horrors were bartered for intelligence in the first moves of the Cold War, and the vanished gold of Hungary continues to haunt vaults and archives across Europe. What unites them is not only their brutality, but the silence that followed. The silence of victims denied justice, the silence of states that chose secrecy over truth, and the silence of a public allowed only a sanitized version of the war. Yet silence does not erase. Beneath the soil of Kolyma, on the quarantined earth of Grenade, in the ruins outside Harbin, and in the alpine tunnels of Austria, the past waits. These are not relics of a distant age, but reminders that history is fragile, vulnerable to the scissors of censorship and the ink of secrecy. The question that remains is chilling in its simplicity. If such truths could be hidden for decades, what other shadows still lie sealed in the archives, waiting for the day their silence breaks?